To find out everything about the history, creation, and use of atomic bombs in World War II, read my book, The Atom as a Weapon, which is available on Amazon and also at the WeClap store. If you want to buy this copy here, autographed by me for you, just send an email to saladeguerra@gmail.com with your zip code so I can calculate the shipping cost. Very well, welcome to our channel, which today is hosting a great longtime friend of mine, Rui Botelho. Professor Rui Botelho, who is a former employee of the Brazilian Space Agency and also currently the head of the Brazilian Space Blog, which is a source of information about the Brazilian space program, and also now about developments in the space program and this new space race we've been witnessing over the past few years. So, Rui, thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you very much for giving a little of your time to talk with us about this subject.
Hi, Julio. Thank you very much. Thanks to your great audience. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, talking about a subject that interests us a lot, right? We also share a passion for the space sector. I got to know you through your studies in the space sector before I met you. I won't say in person because we've never met in person, but we met in discussion groups on Facebook, WhatsApp groups, and so on. And we've developed this fraternal friendship, this mutual respect, even though we haven't met in person. But I got to know you long before meeting you on social media. I already knew your work through your studies, especially your master's thesis, right? And other articles you wrote, I believe, during the process of writing your thesis, and you published these articles at national and international events, and that also led to your book, right? Which talks precisely about a bit of the history of the Brazilian space program, the social impacts, and the impact on the industry. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you very much, Rui. This first book of mine was published in 2017. Right? It was published in 2017. And it's still available for sale on Amazon, okay? The social impact of the Brazilian space program. I'll also leave the link here in the description if you're interested in getting it. I'd like to start, Rui, by asking you, why did Brazil need to start over, right? Brazil needed to, after decades of basically inaction there in Alcântara, right? And the Brazilian Space Agency itself proposing and canceling projects. What motivated this new beginning? We know that back in the early 2000s, there was even a partnership with Ukraine to develop a launcher, a binational launcher, and that Alcântara came back into focus with the reconstruction of the launch platform, which was destroyed in the VLS-3 tragedy. And how did we get to this point, Rui?
Well, Julio, it's a long story, right? We don't need to be exhaustive, but we do need to know a little bit. I've mentally organized, more or less, some stages of this process, right? I'll just give a brief overview here of this process, which culminates in the second to last stage. So, talking about the Brazilian space program, it started in 1953, right? And it goes, I would say it goes up to the phase called pre-MECB, Pre-Complete Brazilian Space Mission, which is how I organize the ideas in my mind. I really like making these mind maps, you know? Organizing the ideas and putting together some information, classifying it, which goes from 1953 to 1978, okay? During that period, neither the world nor Brazil could have imagined there would be commercial space exploration, right? Which is our focus here today. During that period, there was still a Cold War going on, a struggle for economic, military, and technological dominance, right? Which led to the space race as we know it. But alongside that, Brazil was developing a space program that, in its early stages with all the difficulties, right? Still building up human capital. We made several advances, okay? But at the same time, during that phase, there wasn't really an objective other than technological mastery, like everyone wanted to have, to master the technology in its three main branches, right? ground infrastructure, whether for launches or for tracking space objects.
Ah,
The launcher, right? Access to space and the space technologies themselves, satellites, probes, and so on. So the MECB, this first phase, which goes from 53 to 78, had no commercial missions. Everything was based on technological mastery. The second phase is the MECB, the Complete Brazilian Space Mission, which grew out of a Congress held in Rio de Janeiro. If I'm not mistaken, around 77 to 78, when the foundations of this program were defined. What did that mean? It's about having a national base, launching a national vehicle, carrying a national satellite, okay? At that time, Brazil could establish partnerships. Look for already established international partners and even try to launch something with those partners. But the MECB continues the pre-MECB phase, seeking to master all this technology. There is a school of thought that discusses the dual-use potential of launch vehicle technology in creating a vehicle capable of carrying weapons of mass destruction. That also happens. Many Soviet and American programs had their launch vehicles derived from versions of ballistic missiles. So that's a trend, and Brazil was not far from that development path. Whether there would necessarily be one or not is a question that will never be fully clarified. Document-wise, there is nothing formally written about this. And our launch vehicle, which is the VLS, it was too complex to be a ballistic missile, right? So its capabilities, its size, that cluster structure with 4 side boosters and a central one, made its use very complicated, right? Even to store it in silos, etc., it was pretty complicated. Yes, but there's this derivation. And all of this, which already came from the pre-MECB phase itself. Some developed countries started not wanting to share technologies and, let's say, creating certain obstacles for Brazil to develop its own technologies. It's no wonder that this fact is widely reported out there. At the time, it was even reported by William Wack himself, right? He reported that Brazil smuggled 4 inertial navigation systems from Russia. From Russia? That's right. We smuggled them. Actually, the person who brought this material at the time wasn't smuggling because there were no prohibitive regulations, right? It was just strange to bring high-tech equipment like that as personal luggage for use in the VLS. So nobody wanted to give technology to Brazil. There started to be several restrictions, embargoes, and so on. And the MECB, this phase of the MECB, I say that the BMS-78 lasted until 2003. Even though officially the MECB was only dissolved when the VLS program ended, which was in 2016 officially. But in fact, the end was in 2003 with the explosion that happened there in Alcântara, right? Explosion, no. The premature ignition of the engines that incinerated the TMI mobile integration tower and 21 professionals who were inside, right? Working, and it caused the second biggest space accident in recorded history. Well, factually, the program ends there, right? The MECB. Then the courage and political will to continue with the VLS was lost. And from the late 1990s into the early 2000s, Brazil signed a framework agreement with Ukraine. And that was in 99, okay? So it was a little before the Alcântara accident. And in 2000, Brazil missed the opportunity.
Oh,
They chose not to sign a technology safeguards agreement with the Americans, still during Fernando Henrique's administration. Despite other stages of this complete Brazilian space mission having been achieved. For example, in '84, the Alcântara base was already active, right? And in '93, we managed to finish the project for our first satellite, the SCD, which was launched by an American rocket, right? Pegasus. In '98, we launched the SCD-2. Okay. So the ground part and the space part were complete. The Alcântara base also embodies a search for a better location for launch, which is somewhat questionable now for this reason. Alcântara is 2 degrees south of the equator. It's an excellent location. It's the best in the world today for various reasons, not just because of the location, but also because of its proximity to the equator. For those who don't know, planet Earth spins at a higher speed at the equator than at the poles. In the tropics, that's nothing. And because of that, in the direction of Earth's rotation, a rocket launched from west to east ends up getting a boost in momentum. If the launch is equatorial, that boost is almost 100% of Earth's velocity. Every time you tilt it up to 90 degrees, that boost vector decreases until it becomes orthogonal, and that boost factor drops to 0. But we had, and still have today, an excellent base, which is the CLBI, the Barreira do Inferno Launch Center, which is at 5 degrees south. The only launch center closer to the equator, regardless of whether it's in the southern or northern hemisphere, is Kourou, which is at 5 degrees. So this precision, this meticulousness about Alcântara was to create a center still with that governmental strategic vision, far from everything, out of sight, and so on, for a gain of just under 3 degrees of difference, which is, I'll tell you, very little, to make up for the disadvantages, right? It's very little, right? Yeah? And at that time when Alcântara was created, there wasn't any progress yet. It's real estate, right? The speculation that exists in that region of Natal Parnamirim. The Barreira do Inferno Launch Center was integrated with the Natal Air Base as one contiguous area. It was a single piece of land. All of it belonged to the Air Force. And over time, right, that speculation, the land grabbing, everything started surrounding the center. But that was more around the 1980s, the 90s, and the 2000s. So if the CLBI had remained as a launch center, we would still have a major center. And we would have, if its land had been kept intact with a security zone around it, we would have a major launch center, not for heavy vehicles, but for smaller vehicles. But, well, that phase ends with the MECB in 2003. We enter the third phase, which is the post-MECB phase, or the cyclone phase. As I said, before the end of the MECB phase, in '99, Brazil signed a framework agreement. What is a framework agreement? It's a memorandum of understanding, a cooperation protocol. Nothing binding, very generic. It says that the two countries have things in common and that they can collaborate in various areas in the space field. And Brazil lost in 2000 this technological safeguards agreement with the United States, which had clauses that were indeed questionable in terms of sovereignty. but that could have been discussed a bit more. And after 2003, we entered this other phase, which is the post-MECB cyclone phase, which is already a new stage, already a transition to a commercial vision for the use of the Alcântara Launch Center, which is really a partnership, this time a more robust one, that is signed right after the Alcântara accident on October 21, 2003. Brazil signs a long-term treaty with Alcântara for the use of the Cyclone vehicle, a vehicle of Ukrainian Soviet origin. It's a legacy of the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. Ukraine, which in the history of the Soviet bloc has always been a region of a lot of industry and a lot of development in the aerospace, aeronautics, and space fields. And the Cyclone-4 is an already operational Ukrainian vehicle, which already had a history of launches. Although it was a vehicle with technologies that, let's say, were already a bit outdated for its time, it was still considered an efficient vehicle with an acceptable payload capacity for what Brazil was looking for. It's also worth remembering, Julio, a bit earlier during the MECB phase, an important fact, which is Brazil signed between 1985 and 1988 an agreement with China for the development of the CYBERS program, which is the China-Brazil Earth Resources Satellite. And the MECB foresaw, in addition to the two SCD satellites, SCD-1 and SCD-22 remote sensing satellites, with the same mass range from 150 to 200 kilograms, which should be carried by the BLS. And this agreement was made by INPE, the civil branch of the program, with the Ministry of Science and Technology funding it. If I'm not mistaken, it was Renato Archer and Halpe who led these agreements. Brazil is moving towards development, perhaps trying to reduce the impact of Western embargoes, etc., seeking China's support to develop this satellite. And we move from a range of satellites planned in the MECB of 150 to 200 kilograms to a satellite of 1.5 tons with China. Launched in China. So this program, besides sharing responsibilities with another partner, in terms of risks and costs, it also brings with it the launch of the satellite, which does not depend on Western powers. This, on one hand, is good, right? But on the other hand, you see that a parallel space program to the MECB is being created. And you point this out well in your book. You show it in graphs. The increase in the CYBERS budget means a reduction in the budgets of the other programs, both launchers and satellites. CYBERS, it kind of it drains, right? It drains, right? It takes away the program's resources, and let's say it also ends up weakening the MECB. But when you move on to another phase, which is phase 3 after MECB, CPON, already in 2003-2015, CYBERS is already a consolidated program, but no Brazilian remote sensing satellite ever got off the ground. That's when the idea for the Amazonia satellite comes up with the PMM, but it's still very incipient. And in this initiative, you have the creation of the binational public company ACS already on August 31st. That is 3 years later, practically, ACS is created. ACS, Alcântara Cyclone Space, was a binational public company that would use the space, the Alcântara Launch Center, to launch the Cyclone vehicles. What was advantageous for the Ukrainians? Because the Ukrainians are hemmed in around the Black Sea. With Russia, which historically, since the dissolution, has never accepted Ukraine's independence. Historically, even before the First World War, it also never accepted an independent Ukraine, a Ukrainian nation. Ukraine had difficulties launching the vehicle from such a high latitude, but it was also caught in a situation where, on one side, you have Russia, and on the other side, you have NATO. In the south, there's also Turkey. So any incident during a launch would be a complicated situation. So launching from Alcântara for the Ukrainians, it was important to use a vehicle commercially, to develop this part of the space sector commercially, since, for example, in the cargo area, the Antonovs are, to this day, fantastic machines, and they are the largest cargo planes in the world. They already had this success, but in the space area, they stagnated commercially, precisely because they didn't have partners with launch sites. In addition to Brazil, they pursued partnerships with Canada and others. But at that moment, Brazil was Ukraine's safest bet, and for Brazil, Ukraine was a relief. To ease the pressure regarding the VLS problem, which despite the 2003 accident was still officially ongoing and had not been officially completely terminated. So launches from there would reduce this pressure, and in a way, if the launches using the Cyclone had taken place, maybe the VLS program, let's say, would have been discontinued earlier, and another solution would have been sought, which actually came up as a proposal at the time, which was the VLM. The VLM also comes up along this path, which is a smaller vehicle than the VLS, but it was already following a global trend of reducing satellite masses, smaller payloads, and so on. And for Brazil, at least on a scientific level, small data collection satellites, less robust satellites, and remote sensing satellites made sense. And there would be the Cyclone to launch bigger things in the ton range. That was the idea behind the Cyclone. And the capital that Brazil invested in this first initiative with a commercial focus, Brazil invested through Infraero. Please remember the name. Infraero has since become Nave Brazil. Later on, we'll talk about it again. So at the time, the program envisioned something around 500 million reais between the two countries. Brazil contributed through Infraero, initially $80 million in today's values, $130 million, or 675 million reais. And that was already in 2000 and in 2006. And sometime later, I think a year later, another $25 million were contributed. Today, it's around 200. So in total, in today's values, Brazil contributed about $380 million, around 1.98 adjusted, right? Adjusting the values to the present time, right? Another moment that happened in this partnership was a naivety on Brazil's part. I'm not sure if it's naivety or incompetence. Why? Because the Cyclone rocket, it contained in some components of American origin. Right? So it's supposed to be launched in Brazil, but the United States blocked the launch. The satellite, the Cyclone vehicle, had some components of American origin that were listed under ITAR. That's right. That's right. And then Brazil had refused years earlier the United States' safeguard agreement. Right? Yeah. And that not only limited the launcher, but also prevented Brazil from launching any satellite with American technology, which is equivalent to about 50 to 60% of Western launches, right? Not even ESA launches satellites using only European technology. Do they have the capability? Yes, they do. They do. They do. They do. They do. Because the American industry is much stronger than the European one. It's cheaper for you to acquire American components. You see that in the aeronautical field, right? Our Gripen is a Swedish fighter jet with an American J-79 engine. So that's it. That's it. The commercial pursuit isn't just about seeking sovereignty. It's about looking for something that's reliable and that you can use commercially. So, from this commercial perspective, launching from Alcântara also faced a blockade because Brazil hadn't signed the Technological Safeguards Agreement, right? And then, with this blockade, the program, the cyclone phase, started to dwindle, right? And a rocket was never launched from there. We also had problems because the Cyclone used hypergolic propulsion technology using hydrazine, which is an extremely toxic and poisonous fuel. They say that anyone who has smelled hydrazine can already tell if they can identify it, right? That's how toxic it is. And other mistakes were made during the implementation of the ACS with the construction of the ACS headquarters itself, the facilities, and the launch pad. In Alcântara, in the northernmost part, right, of the center's main area. Today, with the new reconfiguration, this area is still within the launch center area, and it borders Mamuna, which is a Quilombola region. There's a river there, the Mamuna River, that separates Mamuna from the ACS. I was there at that place. It was one of the alternative places for us to watch the launch of Rambit Nano in December, right? To get to know the place. The Rambit Nano launch site was 3.5 kilometers away, and the ACS area was 1 kilometer from where we were. Up there on the highest part of the cliff, on the elevation where the river now divides the civil area from the military area. So we had several environmental problems. The companies themselves that were involved in the consortium were implicated in contractor scandals, which we know well from Brazil's recent history. And all of this made the implementation and operation of the ACS even more complicated. And in the end, it dwindled. The Quilombola movement itself in the 2000s once again reinforced all these issues. Areas, and these were problems generated during the implementation of the center in the 1980s. I remember that the 1988 Constitution came after the expropriation of Alcântara. So we can't judge by today's laws those who implemented the center back then according to the rules that existed at that time, right? So it really wasn't violent in the sense of physical violence, but it was something very abrupt. The people were removed, right? And so that the center could have a larger area for development and so on and so forth. So that also happens at this moment. And then, at the end of July 2015, Brazil terminates the agreement with Ukraine. Right? The Ukrainians really weren't, let's say, fulfilling their part anymore. They saw before we did that things weren't going anywhere and started to hold back their participation. A lot because the problems, let's put it this way, not just technical ones, involved the rocket. But many of the legal problems, even internationally speaking, were caused by Brazil, not by Ukraine. Yes, I'm not trying to say who's right or wrong. I'm just sharing both perspectives, right? And Brazil denounced it on July 16, 2015, and that's when it effectively ended. Even though ACS as a public entity, because it's a binational public company, was only officially dissolved by a provisional measure in 2018, with Provisional Measure 858, which was approved in April 2019 by the National Congress and became law, the Dissolution Law. There was the law that created ACS and the law that dissolved ACS. And during that time, between 2015 and 2019, I was at EB during that period, and all anyone talked about was the TCU investigating ACS. And the TCU points out several weaknesses in an agreement, many of which I've mentioned to you here, but it's the TCU ruling 227/2017. Anyone who wants to check it out, it's available on the internet. And it talks about several problems: lack of strategic vision for the space program, lack of geopolitical vision in the decisions, and so on, and technical issues, budget issues, questions about bidding and contracts. That, in a major ruling, the Court of Auditors dismissed the action that questioned the hiring of the companies, etc., 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 because it considered that when Brazil denounced the agreement, the case had become moot, etc., those kinds of things. These technicalities that leave us kind of like, so? But a very strong report came out talking about the bad decisions, the lack of vision, governance, strategy, and management in this project. And then once again, the idea of Brazil launching something from its own territory dies, even if it's with a foreign vehicle, and now with a commercial perspective. Also, during this period in 2016, the VLS program was terminated. Officially terminated in 2016.
And it's curious, Rui, that I was there in 2014. The only time I was at DCTA, I actually went to a seminar at IAE. That's where I did the last round of interviews for my master's research. And at that seminar, the coordinator of the VLS, the coordinator of the VLS program, he was announcing the contracts for the manufacturing of nets, right? Nets of some kind. He was basically announcing a big step, a major advance in the development of prototype number 4. And that prototype number 4 would be almost ready to fly. That was around September, I think. September, October of 2014. It was right there around the 2014 elections. I remember that. Then 2 years later, the program is canceled. And that makes me quite thoughtful about the whole nature of the work being done there at IAE, at the Institute of Aeronautics and Space. Because I heard from the VLS coordinator, and I also heard from other researchers who were presenting those posters there, right? About their annual work, the work they do. And then one of those researchers there confided in me the following, that they were getting approval on the merits for their project. We're getting approval on the merits here. They're saying it's great, that this is wonderful, but where's the funding approval? I want to build this here, right? I don't want a pat on the back. Wow, what a nice job. I want to build this here. How does this situation line up with the reality of this broader plan of rocket operations and Brazilian space development?
Yeah, that's what's called the budget war. They don't, there's a practice in public administration in the space sector. I can speak about this very well, which is keeping projects alive on life support, right? Keeping the project on mechanical ventilation, right? Artificially, so as not to lose the resources. When the project is terminated, do you have something to replace this here? You don't. And then while you don't have something, that budget is taken away. So These are grants that support people. There are people at DCTA and NP. At EBITDA, I knew someone who'd been a grantee for over 15 years. A grantee does not have an official employment relationship. A grantee does not pay into Social Security. They don't have their work cards signed, unless I'm mistaken. I don't know if the law has changed. So it's a precarious work situation, right? Even though the salary, I'm not going to say, there were grantees at EB who earned more than technologists. They earned $15,000 a month. My salary was there as a technologist in 2016. It ranged from 10,000 to 12,000 Rs, right? Between 10 and 12,000, something like that, right? So, like, you had scholarship holders who, at that time, were getting a 15,000 Rs scholarship.
They would accumulate scholarships, right? They would accumulate scholarships.
Or just a single scholarship. You couldn't combine scholarships, but I had access to some projects, not all of them. This thing is very compartmentalized for several reasons. But we had access to scholarships there, and people used to get a 15,000 real scholarship at that time. If you consider that the guy is going to pay his own Social Security, his part, the employer's part, so that one day he can think about retiring. Considering that he doesn't have health insurance coverage, the scholarship holder doesn't have it. Considering a number of other factors, it's a salary that I would even say is low, right? Because in the end, the guy will be left with that amount per month when he doesn't have transit benefits or any of those other perks, right? So, I believe that in the end, the guy would end up with less than what I used to take home, right? Back at EB. But anyway, that's one situation. So when the project is canceled, that resource disappears. And people keep it going so they can keep putting money into it, especially if that project isn't removed from the PNAE. Right?
So National Space Activity Program.
That's it. So that's the modus operandi. We saw this with satellites. For example, Mirax and Iquaz. Right? There was a time when there wasn't enough money for both, so they combined both satellites into one satellite called LATS. But Iquaz is an equatorial satellite, and Mirax was a high-inclination satellite. They combined the two projects to be able to justify it, right? Maintaining the teams, etc., etc. The missions were just incompatible. Since those who approve the budget in Congress don't understand this, this kind of thing gets through, right? Lay people, the ignorant, don't realize how impossible it is to have a satellite that's both equatorial and high inclination. Polar. So it's absurd, but that's how it's done. Now until recently, both Mirax and Iquaz were removed from one plan, and in the next one they appeared as LATs, which combined the two missions. And now, if Iquaz is being revived, I don't know what's going on with Mirax. Mirax became Nano-Mirax. Actually, it became Proto-Mirax, which was a balloon. To validate the technology of receiving high-energy rays from space and detecting where they came from, for the detection of supernovas, etc., etc., etc. And it became Nano-Mirax, which is a CubeSat. Okay? It hasn't been launched yet, also due to lack of resources. So, turning a satellite of, 200, 250 kilos maybe, into something of 1.5 kilos, not that there aren't problems, but the thing is there are technological limitations because of the size, right? The precision, etc., etc. But that's what the space program has been doing. It's like robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? So that's a rule, let's say a procedural standard. But then Julio, after that phase, let's say the third phase, we reach the current phase, let's say. Because since 2016, it's been 10 years. And historically speaking, you're a historian, 10 years in history is nothing. So I can't really say if this phase is over or not. Maybe in another 10 years, we can look back and say no. Actually, when we talked back then, a certain moment had already passed. But that's the phase when the Alcântara Space Center comes up, so it stops being just the Alcântara Launch Center. The idea of a space center comes up, and then there's the story, right, of creating a state-owned company called Alada. It comes up at the end of the problem with ACS. That's when the story of Alada appears. If I'm not mistaken, one of the first journalists, one of the first people who officially recorded the story of Alada was Caiofa. It seems to me that he was in 2016 at an event in Peru. In the aerospace field, he was covering the space defense area there. I would need to confirm that, but the reference I have right now at the moment is him. It's just that in one of the presentations, an Air Force brigadier said there would be a company called Alada. I think it was around that time. That's when the story about Alada is made public, not necessarily when the ideas come up. And then we enter this fourth phase of use, the commercial launch phase of the Space Center, the Alcântara Launch Center, Brazil, our PBM, in which the idea is if we grant the use of the area not to bring in launchers anymore, but to make partnerships with launcher companies. I mean, we don't have our own launcher. We can't use a partner's launcher. So now we're going to open the launch center, all its infrastructure, so this space can be rented or leased by private entities. And this has been in the works for a long time. And this story, it has several foundations.
Alicerces.
One of its foundations is defense of the project that was being created within the Air Force. The CCs was created, right? This happened in parallel with the creation of the National Defense Strategy, which was in 2012, which created the CCs, which was dissolved this year. The CCs had a very specific purpose, right? Which was to create the PSE, which is the Strategic Program for Space Systems of the Air Force, which is a parallel program to the PNAL. Then the Air Force says, the PNAE is a civilian program. My military program is PESI. PC was published around 2014. Something like that, right? NDE is from 2012, the National Defense Strategy, which defines that the three main focus areas and critical technologies would be nuclear, which was historically with the Navy, and cyber, which was assigned to the Army,
and space with
the Air Force. So, mandated by this National Defense Strategy, the Air Force creates CSIS, which is this Commission for Space Systems. Bye-bye. And develops the PSE, presents the PSE. And within this strategy, the first points were laid out. What were they? The Air Force constellations that it needs. Then SGDC emerges. And so does the constellation currently in place, which is Karkara, which is a radar satellite. Then these Air Force constellations emerge, which have primarily military and defense objectives.
See. Hey, but here's the thing. Explain something to me here. PSE, being a military program, is carried out by the Air Force, which is also organizationally still responsible for the launch. For the development of launches for the civil program. In other words, the FAB still has a strong presence in the Brazilian civil space program since its creation, right? Since its creation with GTEP. But now it also develops, launches, and carries out its own program, its own military program, without withdrawing or giving up its prerogative within a civil program. And the foreign experience, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong here, the foreign experience, it proves that this divided administration of space activities, that is military and civilian in completely separate commands, is counterproductive. It doesn't lead to good results. Europe started doing this, right? At the very beginning, before ESA was formalized, but then they unified the commands within ESA. What I mean is, the Brazilian space program, I believe, suffers a lot from this duality of command, because the AEB, does it have the authority? I don't know if it has the regulatory authority to control the DCTA, right? To control the Air Force within the Department of Aerospace Science and Technology. But we don't have a civilian research and development center for rockets and space launch vehicles. That is a regulatory responsibility, or at least until recently, I would say it was a regulatory responsibility of the Air Force. And I'll revisit an impression I had back in 2014 when I visited the IAE. For those who don't know, the IAE is located inside a military organization, right? Therefore, it is also a military organization. The IAE is headed by a colonel from the Brazilian Air Force. So they really resent the strict military environment, right? In other words, you have a set time to arrive, a set time to leave, and even a specific time to work, which is counterproductive for creative work, an activity that's focused on goals, right? To meet goals, to meet deadlines, to achieve targets. When the time's up, that's it. Everyone leaves. Why? Because it's time to go, right? And that doesn't resume until Monday. So the spark of creativity is unequivocally interrupted by bureaucracy. I'd like you to comment a little bit about that characteristic.
Julio, this is a pursuit. I tell you that it's equivalent when you try to define these competencies. It's the same thing as conjoined twins, right? It was originally created that way. And these boundaries are never well defined. On one hand, but on the other, there are areas where one doesn't enter the other's territory. There are various sinecures in this area. When NASA was created, there were several entities in the United States, both civilian and military, researching rockets. They weren't even satellites, they were rockets. And this caused a waste of financial resources and manpower, which scattered the efforts. NACA, which was the predecessor of NASA, had its own centers, but there were other centers linked to the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Just a few.
I think just one, Von Braun's rocket group in Huntsville, Alabama, which was independent.
That's right. So, when NASA was created, it was to unify these forces for civil exploration. But at that time, there was already a clear direction for the development of ballistic force programs. There were also Navy and Air Force programs and ballistic missile programs, so there was quite a variety. At that moment, that was the interest. I think Brazil has already moved far beyond that phase. And the big problem we see in this is what was created from it. The AEB was added to the system after the existence of the other two major players, which are the DCTA and the AE and the AV, right? And the incorporated. The AEB was created in '94. These two entities had already existed since the 1960s.
Tá.
But the AEB was created in a position the AEB had two purposes at its creation. I believe, from what I understood from the law, from what I understood, what was wanted strategically, geopolitically, and in terms of organizational governance. The AEB was created first to show that the Brazilian program was civilian, to reaffirm that. That's because the 1988 Constitution already prohibited Brazil from developing nuclear weapons. Brazil had already signed the MTCR. Brazil already had, President Collor himself ordered the pit there in Serra do Cachimbo to be filled in, symbolically and all that, you know. So, but even so, there was still a very strong military dominance in the program. We were already under civilian government. Democracy had already returned. We were under civilian governments. And the AEB was created with that purpose, to have a civilian entity monitoring everything, right? For the civilian program. The law that created the AEB doesn't say at any point that it is an entity, a civilian organization for the management of Brazilian space activities. But at no point does it say that the Air Force can't develop anything. Sindai itself, which is after the AEB was created by law in '94, the PNDI was created, which is the national policy for the development of space activities. And besides the PNDI, the Sindai was created years later, which is the national system for the development of space activities, all by decree. So the AEB is created by law, the others by decree. And the AEB was created in the presidency for what purpose? It is advising the presidency to have a high level of dialogue. Where what the AEB decided would be with whom? Chief of Staff's office? The Institutional Security Office, which used to be called the Military House, right? Yeah, where there are the two advisory offices for public servants, which deal with civil activities. With the Brazilian Public Service, with all Brazilian public services, it's the Chief of Staff's office that organizes that. And the Institutional Security Office, which had a certain role, especially before the Ministry of Defense existed. It had this role of coordinating the military forces, since each one was a ministry. With the creation of the Ministry of Defense, the Military House became the Institutional Security Office, whose function is to ensure the security of the presidency and to make sure the presidency is supplied with information through the bin in order to make strategic decisions. And the AEB in this scenario would play that role in the civilian program, not the military one. But since it was already decided that the launchers would no longer be ballistic missiles, you had a civil program that still had military roots. And in this position, the AEB was in a position to deal with the armed forces not on equal terms, but from a superior position, and with the other entities as well. Mm-hmm. But then they decided to remove the agency from there, and then, from that point on, I don't know if you're already familiar with it, here I have this book of mine, Brazilian Space Agency, a Management Assessment. In it, drawing on my experience at the AEB, I share some information about how the AEB was created, about how the AEB was being weakened over time. The AEB is a autonomous federal agency. It is not part of the federal government's direct administration. It is not a ministry. So in my view, and I argue this here in the book, the AEB could not be changed by decree. A provisional measure with legal force would be needed to change it. But the AEB was placed under the ministry by decree, and every change in the AEB has been made by ministerial decree, no longer by provisional measure, no longer by discussion in Congress. So this really weakened the AEB. Because when you deal with an entity that needs to be discussed in Congress, where there are checks and balances in parliamentary debate, you don't make the discussion merely a technicality. You make it a national strategic vision. And the AEB's budget should be discussed in Congress as a special budget, which it is not. So all of this caused the AEB to lose prominence and be swallowed up by the other two entities. The AEB does not lead the Brazilian space program. I state this categorically. It has never led it. Because it's not the AEB that determines the path. The other entities state their intentions. And the AEB says, oh, you want to do this? You want to do this? Then let's do it. The AEB doesn't say, I want to achieve these national goals within a given time frame. I don't want to fund scholarships for those researching at MP. Earthquakes. That's not directly related to space. A space program is about practical application, not theory. It's not conceptual and theoretical research. It's applied work. Do you need theory? Yes, you do. But it's applied work. So that's the big problem. And separating that got complicated. So much so that in this phase 4, with the idea of the emergence of ALATA, a discussion started from that point on about what to do, to create a higher level body to discuss it. Then the CDPEB was created. Deliberative Council of the Brazilian Space Program. The first one, which was to analyze in 2017, 2016, 2017, the space program, created a working group. I don't know what. Want to stall progress? Form a working group. Then, my friend, then you get those talks, those meetings, those little coffee breaks.
Those months-long sessions just to decide where everyone is going to sit at the table, right?
That's right. This needs to be top-down. AEB, return to the presidency and state your plans. If you want to work with AEB and get funding, join in. Otherwise, find your own funding for your work. Right? And why? That's when the CDPEB was created. Then, above the CDPEB, the National Space Council was created. NSC. It was decided by the CDPEB that an NSC needed to be created. Look at how many entities are above just to be able to manage this whole apparatus. But none of that was necessary. A small change in the law of the AEB would already create that body. When the AEB was created, there is a Superior Council of the AEB, which when it was created was composed of ministers. Who else besides a minister is below the president? No one. The AEB's Superior Council is already that entity. When the legislator created the AEB, he already created the forum above the AEB to discuss the space program. None of that was necessary. But that's the point. For the Superior Council of the AEB to work, the AEB would have to leave the ministry and return to the presidency. And nobody sees this need for governance at a higher level. Then they start creating makeshift solutions. You know when you keep patching up what's already patched? And then it becomes schizophrenic in terms of governance, where you have the CNE, below that the CDPEB, below the CNE, the AEB, and then it turns into this madness. So this phase 4 is marked by that. And why is that? First, to ensure that LATA was the LATA that was created and was linked, because ACS, even though it received resources from Infraero, which was linked to the Air Force, LATA was subordinate to AEB to ACS. Sorry. ACS was civilian, subordinate to AEB. And why? Because it was an agreement between two countries, a civilian agreement. ACS couldn't be subordinate to the Air Force. Following both countries' protocols, this would become a civil and military program. If you're linked to the Air Force, it's a military program. So the ACS was created linked to the AEB. And now with LADA, since there are no more agreements with any country, the Air Force says the following: the launch center is mine. It doesn't matter if Julio, Rui, or whoever is watching pays the taxes. If AEB transfers resources annually to maintain the center belongs to the Air Force. If the center belongs to the Air Force, any money that comes out of there has to stay with the Air Force. That's the mindset. So the fight at this other stage is that with ACS, it was supposed to be commercially exploited, and the money from ACS would go to the National Space Fund. The funds from ACS would go to this National Space Fund, which would provide financing. Since LADA is linked to the Air Force, the National Space Fund doesn't receive anything. Okay? So, this Phase 4 is the phase where we look for money to be in the hands of the Air Force, so the Air Force can manage it. Then once again, an extremely asymmetric situation is created where the main entity, theoretically the AEB, doesn't even have the resources in its hands to manage the Brazilian space program. It doesn't have the authority to decide where to allocate resources. All resources will go through the Air Force. Right? One way or another, the decision ends up being made by the Air Force. Why? Because it's a public company linked to the Air Force.
The Air Force LADA. Rui, and this, I believe that somewhere along the way, something changed quite a lot in the entire course of action of the Brazilian space program or of Brazilian space activities. I believe that after everything you've said here, the term Brazilian space program isn't even valid, because a program presumes that there is a program, that there is a sequence of goals, a sequence of actions to be taken. That's not the case. It's a set of Brazilian space activities. Well, so Brazilian space activities are greatly shaken up, I would say, by what's been done with reusability, by the reusability that Musk put on the table starting in 2015, which was when the first Falcon 9 landed vertically. So this made it so that, in fact, all those predictions that were considered far-fetched from the SpaceX team about cost reduction of the cost per kilogram to orbit were actually observed. So today you have a single first stage being used dozens of times, being reused dozens of times. And as this has become much more concrete, we can observe two phenomena. The first of these phenomena is that the actual cost per kilogram to Earth orbit has decreased significantly. And then the number of missions to space has skyrocketed. The number of annual launches has increased at an astonishing, absurd rate. Last year, I had the opportunity to watch one of these launches in Florida. Another Falcon 9 launch. I mean, now it's become more uma festinha de fim de semana. It happens frequently. It's no longer an event. Super unique. And we see that in the annual report of global space launches, we have the United States clearly dominating up there. And within that North American share, that huge North American slice, you still have SpaceX accounting for more than 90%. It's SpaceX holding a monopoly of more than 90%. That's what causes Brazilian space activities. Então, finalmente, decades of going back and forth, deciding whether to do it or not, saying I need a commercial partner to come here and launch commercial rockets from Alcântara, because I also want a piece of that big money, right? I want a piece of that market. because by making the price per kilo drop, more people have access to this market. So a lot more people want to launch into orbit. And then Brazil comes back into the game like, oh, I have the best base in the world. I have the most advantageous base in the world. So everyone will want me. I'm the prettiest girl at the dance. How does that actually compare to reality, Rui? How do these new scenarios compare to reality?
Hey, Julio, it is. So, we can't say that this advantage of Alcântara is an absolute advantage. Okay? People really sell that idea, right? They really push it, but it's not an absolute truth. Why? Because more than 60% of launches go into orbits with an inclination greater than 60 degrees. Right? Yeah. So, what happens then? For you to launch into high inclination orbits, you don't need to come to the equator. Right? You can launch from anywhere in the world. Are you going to launch into a polar orbit? A sun synchronous polar orbit? You don't need to bring your satellite here to launch. Unless there's a factor, which is what? The launch queue. That's the only issue. Then maybe the cost of setting up logistics to come to Brazil would be worth it. Alcântara, I was there. We even talked to the owner of the company that handled the logistics to take the Rambit Nano there. The Rambit Nano leaves Korea, comes through the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, arrives at the port of Santos, and clears customs. Okay? All of this took more than 2 months to happen. And from Santos, it came by road.
Que eu acho que já é absurdo. Para veículo desse porte, do Rambit Nano, ok. Para veículos maiores, é inimaginável.
To cover that distance. But anyway.
Veio por via rodoviária.
It could go by rail much more cheaply.
Poderia, mas precisaria fazer algumas adaptações, certo? Para que essa ferrovia aí, sul, norte e tal, que tem.
There's a branch that goes to that region of the port of São Luís where you have the export of ore. Itaqui Port, right?
I don't know it. I don't know the name.
You can't transport a vehicle like the Rambit Nano by plane. Besides, it's extremely expensive. You can't send it by coastal shipping because it's too expensive. Right? From there in Santos, unload onto the ship, charter a specific ship to bring it. So what happens? It goes to Santos, gets into that huge customs clearance line at the port of Santos. It takes 2 months, a little over 2 months to release the cargo. The costs go up. Truck, trailer. Escorted. Truck, it's sensitive cargo. Whether you like it or not, there are components there that are sensitive, right? And they need to be protected from everything, not just theft, but also espionage, right? So come on. And then what happens? It's 5 days of travel. After 2 days, you leave Santos and reach the border between Piauí and Maranhão. Piauí-Maranhão. And once it gets into Piauí and Maranhão, even after covering more than 2/3 of the total distance, maybe even 3/4, the remaining stretch still takes 3 days because of the road conditions.
Are the roads in Maranhão really that bad?
Very bad, very bad. There's a construction project for improvements. But that's the reality today. That's the reality the environment found. And then what happens? When you put it on paper, what do I gain by launching from Alcântara if I'm not going to launch into an equatorial orbit? So I won't get the maximum boost, right? At the equator, I won't get the maximum boost from the Earth's rotation. I'm going to launch there at 40, 50 degrees. I'm already losing some of that, right? Well, but what about the logistics cost? And the cost to keep a team of technicians there in Alcântara? Of professionals there? All of this needs to be considered, but no one analyzes it because there's no interest. The interest is in the shallow argument that Alcântara is the best place in the world for equatorial launches, for launching to low inclinations, not for launching to high inclinations. And more than 60% of launches today are into inclined orbits. I'm not even talking about altitude. I'm talking about orbital inclination. Right? And then you have these logistical problems, and you come up with this statement. Alcântara would be fantastic if Brazil, and here I get into the discussion about the existence of the LAR. If Brazil had done a PPP, a public-private partnership, I'm even getting ahead of myself here. Maybe Alcântara would have been more successful. Why? Because Brazil doesn't have resources today. The Air Force, the AEB, doesn't have money to develop the Alcântara Launch Center. Today, there's only one launch pad. When Indospace uses that pad, they use not only the pad, but also the nearby bunker, which overlooks the launcher. They use the radar, they use the base's control center, which is the only one. So you tie up the site with a launch. What would you need? To have multiple and varied launches in parallel sequenced, you need to invest in that infrastructure. Brazil doesn't have money. LEDA was created, a subsidiary of Nave Brazil, which was Era, which in recent years, I have an article, I have a video here on Brazil Space. I did an analysis of Nave Brazil's balance sheet. In recent years, it's been dropping, it's been having annual losses. And considering that our state-owned companies historically have losses, you put in the hands of the public entity, which doesn't have money to invest, a public company that won't have the revenue to be able to invest. Because it's not just with one company and, 5 launches a year of Rambit Nano that will cover the costs of Alcântara. If you start a company, you must think like a businessman. You have to look at costs, revenues, and analyze them. Not this mixed thing. No, it's a company where I only analyze the revenue. But what about the expenses? Direct and indirect.
Who's going to cover the deficit? Vai cobrir o rombo.
Nós.
That's why Brazil Space has been advocating for a long time that Alcântara should be a PPP. How? They would contract 3 slots there. Launch of a small vehicle, a small to medium vehicle, and a medium to heavy vehicle. The companies that won would build the infrastructure.
Certo?
And operate it for a certain period. Don't we do that with the ports? Don't we do that with the airport? Isn't that already a common practice? Yes, the private sector comes in and invests in the airport. Before it was Infraero, so Alada's mindset is stuck in the 80s. At that time, Infraero was the one funding airports. Did it fund the radar system? No. Today, the private sector uses and pays. He uses the airport and pays for the use of the airspace control infrastructure in Torres from Sindacta, the airport control system that has the navigators. So it's like a service. But the airport, the infrastructure there, it's the private sector that pays for it, maintains it, expands it, and operates it.
Hi. Cara, man, adding to what you just said, wouldn't Alcântara be included in that? Yeah, she's basically bound hand and foot. bound hand and foot. In other words, she's unable to make any progress because of the very limitations of the set of factors that led to her being chosen. Because she was designed for a time when, as you said at the beginning, the space program was essentially by nature a quintessentially state-run activity. Secretiva by nature, here in Brazil, even more so because of the duality that was discussed back at the beginning. And therefore, it was an activity that had no commercial purpose whatsoever, no intention of keeping the operation financially viable. It was really just to consume resources.
When you talk about sovereignty, when you talk about technological mastery, sovereignty, national autonomy, the last thing you ask, the factor that's considered the least important, is how much it costs. So if you say we need sovereignty over this, and if it's really strategic, if it's geopolitically necessary for you to have that control, the cost is a factor, but it's not the main one. The main thing is the government's strategic decision. That's right.
So why is that? Man, let's suppose we manage to actually implement the PPP model for space in Brazil and turn it into law. Why would companies invest millions, maybe even billions, I don't know, in building launch infrastructure for a spaceport that's geographically isolated from the rest of the country, man? It's geographically isolated from the road network, the railway network, and as you already mentioned, from the maritime network as well. Yeah. So it's geographically cut off from logistics. It's in a region where it's not easy to find specialized labor or to keep that specialized labor there. And as you already mentioned, there's no technical reason for its location there in the interior of Maranhão. There's no technical justification for that. That's advantageous for launches today that make up the minority of space launches. In other words, for the global space launch market as of 2026, because we can't really talk about the Brazilian space launch market, which virtually doesn't exist. We are trying to get a share of the foreign market. Wouldn't it be simpler to just choose another location more favorable for logistics, closer to training centers, closer to infrastructure that can support this workforce where you think you can keep this workforce? So that in this way, companies can invest money to make Brazil an attractive launch hub.
Julio, excellent question. And to answer that, I need to go back a bit in history. When Alcântara was created, we, at MECB, were building a launch vehicle that would carry a maximum of 350 kilograms into orbits of 600 to 700 kilometers. At the time, a small vehicle, right? Today, a VHC carries 1 ton, right? More. MECB was created for this purpose. In fact, the data collection satellites 1 and 2 were launched with what inclination? 25 degrees. Why? It's a low inclination that from Alcântara, there would be some performance loss, so I wouldn't launch the maximum nominal 350 kilos of the rocket, but I would be able to launch national rockets with this inclination. It's better for you to have an inclination of 25 degrees, where you can, when we look at the movement of the satellite with the Earth stationary, it makes a sine wave movement, right? It goes like this. So when you launch with a 25-degree inclination, it means that this satellite will be passing at some point at 25 degrees south over Brazil and at some point at 25 degrees north of Brazil. Something between that, right? It keeps making this movement. If the inclination is 0, it passes directly over the equator. Each added degree of inclination makes it pass 1 degree north and 1 degree south, and so on. Right? When you launch it at 90 degrees, it will stay at 90 degrees the whole time. It will orbit around the Earth. But, like this, So this was tied together. The choice of Alcântara was tied to this. That's why it was justified to move from the Barreira do Inferno launch center to there, because of this advantage. It was a nationalist, developmentalist, strategic vision for Brazil to dominate space. Valid at that time. Today, commercially, you've already mentioned the reasons why Alcântara is not considered the best location commercially. For what? For launches of small vehicles in high inclination orbits. Right? Why? Because if you look at Kourou, you can see that it's more similar to Alcântara than CLBI is. Because it launches heavy vehicles. Vehicles for geostationary orbits. That is Alcântara's natural role. Because to launch at 90 degrees, I can launch from Rio Grande do Sul. I can launch from CLBI. I can launch from anywhere that doesn't have land and has a projection over the ocean, and that doesn't have land below or maritime and commercial routes. Ideally, it shouldn't be too, how do you say it? That there isn't too much air and sea traffic. So I can launch from Alaska. At 90 degrees, I can launch from Norway. Now, if I want to launch a geostationary vehicle, can I launch from the United States? Yes, you can. SpaceX does that in the United States. But it launches at a certain inclination, and then, as it passes over the equator, it performs maneuvers to change the inclination of the orbit. This is called dogleg, which is the dogleg maneuver that creates that arc. The dog's hind leg has that arc. So, you do a dogleg to be able to maneuver and convert that orbit from an inclination x, which will depend on the latitude where you are, to a zero inclination moving to a certain altitude. That has a cost, a high cost. That's why the French, the Europeans, bring the vehicle from 5,000 kilometers away to launch the Ariane 6 now from Kourou, because they're going to put geostationary satellites or satellites in high orbits. For example, they're not geostationary, but Galileo is at 20,000 kilometers altitude, close to GPS, Beidou, and so on. And Galileo has two types of satellites. It's not a single system. Galileo has the satellites from the Galileo constellation, and also the geostationary satellites from the EGNOS constellation, which is responsible for synchronization. It's EGNOS that increases the accuracy of Galileo. So it's for these orbits that Alcântara is suited. And you don't need to do anything, just look at Kourou. Why do the French, the Europeans, leave Europe and come here to launch? Because of this advantage. Not just to be able to launch. In fact, look at how many launch centers are opening in Europe now. In Scotland, in Norway, in Sweden, now in Santa Maria, in the Azores, and I even wrote an article about it for the magazine of the Superior War College, the ESG. I wrote an article in 2018 for 2019 talking about the competition between the Azores and Alcântara. And that the Azores would take over this market for small European vehicles, since it would no longer make sense to bring small vehicles to launch in South America when you can launch them from Europe itself. The Azores are 1,000 kilometers from Portugal's coast. That's better than being 5,000 kilometers away. The Azores have an airport there in Santa Maria, which is an airport that was built during the World War II, with 3 runways and a taxiway. Alcântara Airport has a single runway without a taxiway, so you must turn around on the runway itself. So, that's the point. And then, you can't think about Alcântara alone. If it were hard to decide, which is not the case, thank God, because making these decisions is also a big responsibility. It's very good for you to analyze here, but this involves a matter of political positioning, which would run into a lot of competing interests and aspirations, some of them even against logic. So you have to think about Alcântara, not just Alcântara, but Alcântara and the CLBI. In the videos we made, in the interviews, in the live streams we did with InnoSpace, we asked, can the Rambit Nano be launched at the CLBI? And everyone says yes. The Rambit Micro.
Micro.
Also, as for the Rambit Mini, it wouldn't be possible because of its size. Today, the CLBI is surrounded by a lot of land. In this article I wrote about the Azores Launch Center, I used the safety zones, the concentric circles of the safety zone. Around the PED of Santa Maria Island in the Malbusca region, where the center will be built, I take this template and place it over the CLBI. The whole civilian area is excluded. Except for Estrada do Sol, which extends into part of the outermost safety zone, which you block during the launch, which is behind the PED. I mean, what are the chances of a rocket that's already been tested, already launched? I'm not talking about a new rocket, but one that's already validated and operational. What are the chances it could go backwards and hit Estrada do Sol in the area where it is? But safety rules always err on the side of caution. You block the road, right? And does that mean you can't go to the area south of the launch center? No, there are other roads and signs there, so you have to take a longer way around. They're not wide roads, they're not highways, but you can get there. You don't need to go through there. And everyone would be outside the safety zone. So Alcântara has to balance not only the launch there, but also has to reactivate the CLBI so that when there's a launch in Alcântara, it doesn't prevent another one at the CLBI. This has to be coordinated. Until a PPP is made to hire an international company to set up a launch pad for medium and heavy vehicles and to explore the potential that Alcântara has. Between nations, Julio, and you know this much better than I do because you're a military historian, and therefore you understand geopolitics much better than I do. Nations don't have friendships, they have interests.
Interests, obviously.
Very well. Who else was launching from Kourou besides ESA?
Russia.
The vehicles left Russia today. They don't have geostationary capability. They have GTO capability. Transfer orbit, geostationary, right? So they don't put the satellite in its final position. They put it in a position where the satellite will have to maneuver, use up some fuel until it gets into position, into geostationary orbit. They can do that. Why doesn't Brazil propose to Russia to operate a launch site at Alcântara, since they are prohibited from launching from there, from Kourou?
It's incredible, right? Because look, Rui, there are partnerships like that in the non-space sector, but in a similar sector, right? It's an astronomical sector. There are partnerships with Russia here in Brazil. Do you know about the IPD?
Yes.
The OPD, sorry. The OPD, which is the Pico dos Dias Observatory, right? Yes.
Yes.
They have a dome that belongs to Roscosmos. They have a dome that belongs to the Russian Space Agency there.
In Brasilia, there is a GLONASS calibration station at the University of Brasilia. I have been there.
That's right. So these things have already been done at other levels, right? And apparently they work well. But in the case of the space program, I believe there are bigger complications, right? Much bigger ones must be influencing it. And I would even say that it's not just national interests, right? Maybe interests supranational.
Yes, the French themselves, ESA, is not interested. Today they took a really big hit because today SpaceX, even launching from 33 degrees there, which is Cape Canaveral. Vandenberg is usually for military payloads, right? No, it's basically military payloads. But like from Cape Canaveral SpaceX launches to really high orbits. Is there loss? Yes, there is. But they can do it. And with the deactivation of Ariane 5 and the delay until Ariane 6 becomes operational, you see that the French have lost a lot of this market. If you consider it, the Brazilian SGDC was launched from Kourou. It's already a geostationary satellite for defense and communications. Of course, it was contracted from Thales Alenia. There's that close relationship, right? And it was launched on Ariane 5. You have the American James Webb because of the characteristics of this orbit, of the orbit that the James Webb needs to have, right? Which is that Lagrange point, right? Between the Earth and the Sun. It's a very high final orbit. It needed the maximum boost from Earth, a huge vehicle, a gigantic satellite, right? I think the James Webb must weigh what? About 6 tons, maybe 7? Something like that. So a very large vehicle, a very large payload, and it needed to go to a very long, very distant final orbit. Yeah, you got it. For your own satellite navigation system, you still need that to maintain those constellations. Rui, but there's a huge trend today of having low orbit constellations for PNT and such. Okay, but that won't replace them. It will improve, it will increase those low orbit positioning satellites. They will improve accuracy. They will contribute to coverage, to the covered area and such through multiple constellations, but they will not replace the satellites that are already in place. GNSS, right? So like investing in Alcântara needs to have this vision to say the following. Look, we're coming in today with what we can, but we need to do more. It's not going to be through Alada that we'll achieve this. So the fundamental mistake, the original mistake of Alada is this. This issue of being a state-owned company with severe budget limitations, right? Structurally speaking, it doesn't have revenue because Nave Brazil does. For a while, Nave Brazil will transfer resources to its subsidiary, right? But Nave Brazil isn't swimming in money here, no. In recent years, its revenue has been dropping, right? Its results. So, like this, the company won't have steady revenue that will cover its costs and the costs of where it operates, let alone put money into the Brazilian space program. So I think that's a diversion from its intended purpose, a huge waste of effort. Right? The Air Force bulldozed the whole public discussion about this, which is another problem precisely because it's a military program. Military activities don't have that kind of discussion. It creates a huge gray area because since it's a public company linked to defense, any questioning will be answered with, no, it's national security. They come with that trump card, that Yu-Gi-Oh card that nobody can beat. Oh, it's national security. We can't provide information about LADA. And look at what will happen, right? I asked for information about ACS and they didn't give it. I have the response here saying, no, this is a matter of national security. It can't be discussed. So, Julio, and pragmatically the issue is there's no money. PPPs. It could be with national companies leading the consortiums and with foreign companies participating, right? But I think that would be the way for you to explore and for the private sector to put in the money. Oh, they're going to operate it for 50 years. Don't our ports operate for 50 years? Aren't our airports 20, 30 years? Aren't our railways 50 years? What's the problem with that? As long as it generates and drives the economy, right? I don't see any problem with it, okay? For me, it's the same thing. If it were 30 or 40 years ago, back in the 80s, I would say that LADA is right. Just like Ejempron from the Navy was created at that time and was a success, Many people are questioning what Agentpron's role will be when all the submarines are ready. And look, Agentpron is a success, and look at how many delays there were in the program due to lack of resources, right? Now, when these submarines are at sea, what will Agentpron live on? How will it sustain itself? What will be its purpose? All that infrastructure, it's huge, like a railway, that huge number of employees. What will Agentpron's future look like? Right? Brazil has a limit on the number of submarines it can operate and maintain. It's pointless to invest for just 4 days, get a submarine, and then have to maintain it afterward. Right? So the question will be about Alcântara. And differently, Alcântara, LADA, has this anachronistic bias. If it were said, no, the government set aside a fund here, look, put it in LADA, LADA will build everything, will operate, will have 10 launches, 20 launches per year. Okay? But with all the issues, logistics, the launch cadence, the operational costs, it's an operational cost that you can't really reduce. There's no military base here. There, on the payroll, there's a colonel. I don't know how many majors. I don't know how many soldiers. Right? They're the ones providing security there. Right? So how is all of this not going to be taken into account? It's the same thing people say about cybers. No, cybers is cheap for Brazil. The satellite only costs $300 million. That's not true. Cost allocation there is incorrect. I've already noted this in some programs. You don't allocate personnel costs. That's the satellite's budget. When you see the annual budget drop into EB's account and you see $180 million for cybers there, then you take 4 or 5 years of cybers, 6 years, let's say, then you say, no, it costs $600 million. No. That's the cost for you to buy parts, for you to buy components. But the cost of man hours isn't there, nor the cost of the MP researcher's time, nor the daily expenses of the MP researcher in China to follow up there. Right? So are the MPE's electricity costs included in this cost? They're not. So this allocation of costs is a whole other world, right? I want to have the performance of the private sector, but I want to have the cost exemptions of the public sector. No, not this. This isn't a cost. This is an investment in national sovereignty. So when you have this kind of double standard where the public company doesn't fully account for or won't fully account for the costs of its operation, right? And the total cost of that is greater than what it generates in revenue. I don't think that's right.
No. Rui, and this one, guys, the last big news we had actually was pretty discouraging, right? It was this new small launch vehicle proposed by the AEB, I believe, which was funded by FINEP, right? And ended up being the target of yet another misappropriation of funds scandal, right?
Yeah, that's really complicated, my friend. Unfortunately, you know that here at Brazilian Space, we have a lot of interaction with the space community, right? Brazilian Space often serves as an outlet, many times. The Brazilian space sector, as I say, teasing Duda, his Bahia fan club could fit in a van, right? And the Brazilian space program, ours, could also fit in a van, right? So everyone knows each other, everyone knows who's who. And in a program where the government still carries a lot of weight in decision making, where there is a very strong dependence on the government. Nobody wants to expose themselves by saying something about what they see as wrong. So even though in Brazil in space we see a lot of things, sometimes we still don't see everything that happens. Or when we do see it, we see it later. And then I move on to the next discussion. We found out about this AKR problem, right? About the VLN AKR many months before. First of all, it was an issue that AKR was holding the project meetings. This was in 2024, right? Well, after the project was signed, from the end of 2023 to 2024 was when the project was signed. AKR signed after the other project, which is MLBR, which is Scenic, which is ahead, which is moving forward. That project is going, thank God. And it was that AKR was trying to exclude the other participants, right? Crux, ESA, right? And insists, right, that ESA is limited technology and covers the decisions, right? So
É,
some meetings were held without inviting people from those companies. And we saw that as an attempt to isolate those companies and keep the resources in AKR's hands. But for us, those were surprises. And what were we doing? We were looking at the consortium, in quotes, right? The institutional arrangement between Scenic and the other companies. And you saw direct meetings. They posted on social media, communications, news snippets, and you could see the interaction between the companies happening. And with AKR, no. AKR was silent. You didn't see the other companies posting anything. And that raised our first suspicion. When January 2025 came, we received a report that AKR was not paying the company's interns. And then that the company was not paying FGTS contributions or the employees' health insurance. This happened between January and February. In February, the Metal Workers Union from San Jose in the region published the news confirming this. And we published this on Brazil Space. But in the meantime, we received a report from someone linked to AKR via email. Not me, not interns, to be able to make this report saying that AKR wasn't able to account for things. And this person brought very precise details. Only someone on the inside could have provided the information they gave us, you know? Just getting an email isn't how we operate. We don't just receive one and publish it. So we took this email, already adding it to all the previous problems, not gathering the other members, not paying the intern. We realized that possibly CAE was heading into financial insolvency. That's what we suspected. But we thought the following: no, K won't touch FINEP's money, a federal agency that has consequences. They wouldn't be crazy to do that. You know, subsidy money. It's different when you overbill for a stretch of road, you know? It's different on a road project when you ask for contract renegotiation or economic financial rebalancing in a contract a company has with the government. But deep down, with the money coming in from subsidies, it's not normal for a company of CAE's stature to get involved in this. So what happened next? We started investigating. We went through March, April, and May. By the first week of June, we already had all the information. Dates of meetings that took place, who the people involved were, who at FINEP wanted to vote to cancel, who at FINEP wanted to save the CAE. We already knew everything. We knew. And then in June, we published the first article talking about the diversion of almost 25 million REs by the CAE. Out of the 41 million REs it received in the first stage. And Brazil especially was the first to publish this. We published a series of articles. We consulted FINEP. In the meantime, FINEP responded in a cowardly way. FINEP's response never mentions K by name. They barely even mention the name of the project. They don't mention the public notice number or anything linking it to CAE.
certo?
We know that in the meantime, CAE lobbied the Ministry of Defense to intercede with the Ministry of Science and Technology so that the scandal wouldn't come out, so that nothing would be published. And we have confirmation of this because in the very week we postponed publication while we were still verifying a few things, the Paris Air Show took place, where CAE announced the contract with that American company that is developing a specific freighter to carry wind turbine blades, which is a giant vehicle that carries those huge blades for wind farms. So, CAE was delaying the release of any news as much as possible because it was at the Paris Air Show that they announced it, and the American company announced the partnership. So that's why we realized we were being boycotted, and even other defense channels we consulted said no. We asked so-and-so from CAE, and he said it's all a lie, that there's nothing like that going on. That next week, everything would be sorted out. Then a week went by, 2 weeks, and nothing was resolved. Nothing is resolved yet. CAE just bought time to finalize the contract with the American company. And what surprises me the most is that CAE was a company that claimed that 80% of its revenue did not depend on Brazil. So they can't say, like Avabras did, that it was delayed payments from the Brazilian government that caused the crisis. Because that's what people often say, right? Oh, Brazil doesn't invest. Many people in the defense sector trying to defend the defense sector end up doing it a disservice because they mix everything together and don't see the trickery behind the smooth talk, right? They don't know how to differentiate, or they don't want to differentiate. If CAE has 80% of its revenue outside Brazil, how can they say, oh, CAE's problem is a general problem? Brazilian companies depend on the government, and the government doesn't invest. That's a reality. The Brazilian government invests minimally in defense. Brazilian companies should invest much more. But that's not the case with SAE, you know?
Então,
Unfortunately, that's what happened. For us, it was a big shock for me and for Duda, because it's not like we expected everything to go right. Because developing a launch vehicle isn't easy. If it were easy, we would have had it a long time ago. But we thought that, by having 2 projects, the chances of success would be greater, right? And we see that right from the start, CAE jumped the gun and already got their hands on that money to cover their own expenses and kept going. Last week, the week before, we published a new article saying that CAE received another email from people who didn't want to identify themselves, asking questions. We got in touch again to talk about CAE's problems, about delays, payments, and so on. In fact, CAE held a meeting and told the managers, directors, departments, and area supervisors to contact their teams, saying there would be a delay in payment. Okay. Then we got in touch with the union, published that article in Brazil in Space with what was reported to us and what the union knows about the situation. And the union confirmed everything, saying that SAE repeatedly, for the past year and a half, 2 years, has been having these crises, that it doesn't make the payments or fulfill its obligations. After a while, someone reports it, the union goes there, puts pressure, goes on strike, organizes a protest. They meet with the union and say they're going to fix it. They start to pay some of the employees who didn't get paid, because sometimes it's not everyone who doesn't get paid, just some. And then the others who were getting paid stop getting paid. So they keep playing a shell game with the workers' wages. And it's all in the report from what we found out and what the union confirmed. That's unfortunate.
Unfortunate? Wow, right at the beginning. That would make any space enthusiast in Brazil lose hope. Hi, and you were there in Alcântara on 2 occasions at the end of last year.
Yes.
And I remember that I followed along because I'm in the Brazilian space group. So I closely followed your posts, everything you did, leaving Salvador first by car, right? Including traveling from Salvador to São Luís and to Alcântara by car. And this journey had a huge impact on me, man, for several reasons. Because first of all, you had to take an extremely long journey to get there. When I say long, it's not because I'm impressed by the distances in Brazil or because Brazil is such a vast country, no. But because, like you said, you arrived there in Maranhão. You faced a huge problem to get to São Luís, and from São Luís, another huge problem to get to Alcântara. I remember you saying, well, we're waking up here in the middle of the night to catch the ferry. And if we miss the ferry, we'll have to wait until the next day. I don't know. Rui, so the launch was canceled, and what happened then, Rui?
Well, Julio, first, it was a fantastic experience, you know, man. It was a life experience. I already knew São Luís. Professional reasons, stopping there to catch a connection to other places, but I never had the opportunity to go sightseeing. It was always for very professional reasons. I would stop there, then catch a flight to another place. Usually in the Northeast, there aren't direct flights to some places, so you have to make several stops. Then I remember that in São Luís, I went to an event, I think it was in Manaus or Belém, and I stopped there to make a connection and all. I stayed there. But I didn't have the opportunity to do any sightseeing, to really get to know the city of São Luís. I didn't know Alcântara. I knew the Alcântara base. I know the CLBI. I know the CLBI very well, right? In fact, I was at the CLBI a few times for the implementation of EB projects. I went there as a technologist, right? A technologist from EB. I went there to follow up on the implementation projects for EB there. Yeah, it was a fantastic experience. Yeah, it was 2,000 kilometers going and another 2,000 coming back. So in total, yeah, just to get there. We left here from Salvador, passed through Senhor do Bonfim, Juazeiro, Bahia, Petrolina, and then we went to Picos in Piauí. Naida, we didn't go to Teresina. We went through another city, Floriano. We crossed from Floriano to Maranhão across the river, right? Yeah, and we headed north to São Luís. The trip, we left here on a Sunday morning, slept in Picos really early. We left here at 4 a.m. on Sunday. On a Sunday, I think it was November 14th, if I'm not mistaken. It was a Sunday. Let me check the calendar here. Let me see if it opens here. I can't open the calendar, but it was something like that. We slept in Picos. And the next morning, we left Picos early and headed up to São Luís. Our estimated time to arrive in São Luís was 1 p.m., around 12:30 or 1 o'clock. According to the GPS in the car and on the phone, we got near São Luís. There was construction going on, that stop and go, and man, we only got into São Luís at almost 5 o'clock, a little after 5 in the afternoon, after about 200 kilometers of that struggle. So yeah, that part was really boring and exhausting. We stayed there in São Luís, did several reports, went to the Federal University of Maranhão, and so on. We did several reports. They're all published. There's even a playlist. Julio, if you could put the playlist link up for everyone, it has all those interviews. And we went to Alcântara on the eve of the launch. We went to Alcântara to get to know the base and prepared ourselves to do the reports in Alcântara and at the launch center. And we didn't know how things work there, right? And then people said, Rui, it's better to get to the ferry around 1 a.m. The first ferry leaves at 3 a.m. So we get there at 1, get in line, and get on the first or second ferry. So I said, okay, cool. We had the car and arrived on time, getting in line between midnight and 1 a.m. There at the port, at the dock, there at Espera. And then we found out why it's called Espera, right? Because we only caught the ferry at 10 in the morning and only arrived in Alcântara at noon. Almost 12 hours to disembark, boarding in Alcântara, waiting in that line on the ferry there.
Is there just one ferry or several going back and forth?
There are several ferries, and they have unlike the ferry boat here in Salvador, the car only goes in one direction. So the car gets to the ferry. It maneuvers to back into the ferry so it can get to the other side and drive out. So unlike the ferry boat here in Salvador to Itaparica Island, you drive on nose first and drive off nose first because it has two gates. The ferry there has only one gate. So there's this issue with the operation itself, which is slow for boarding. And there's the route, right? The ferries are very, I can't say old, but the ones here in Salvador, which I think are old and outdated, are actually modern compared to the ones there, right? And it takes almost 2 hours to get there from Ponta de Espera to the place there in Alcântara, which isn't in the city, is 50 kilometers from Alcântara. So you get to the other side, and you still have to travel 50 kilometers to reach the city of Alcântara. So when we arrived in Alcântara, it was around 1:30 or 1:40 in the afternoon. That made the total travel time over 12 hours. My God.
Man, you went there to do this as a one-off. You don't live there, you don't stay there, and you don't even want to. But I keep thinking about the people who actually have to work there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we counted on help. We have a group of Brazilian space members, just like you have here in the war room. And 2 of our members are from there. There are more, right? There are 3 at least, right? They're from São Luís. And 2 of them stayed full-time with us. They were the people who supported us there. It's Rodrigo Matos and Francisco Ribeiro. So I want to give them a shout out here. It's always recognition for their goodwill, for the partnership, for everything. The guys were there with us. And you include them in a lot of photos and videos. Because up until then, it was just me and Duda. From that point on, we became 4 members of the Brazil EM space team. Yeah, and it was fantastic. It helps. Unfortunately, we came back to... We had to go back to São Luís because of the vehicle's first delay. We went back to São Luís because we needed to check out of the hotel, right? To check out there at the hotel and all. And we left the car there in Alcântara so we wouldn't have to drive across again. And then we walked back. We kept taking Ubers around São Luís. Most of our stories were already done, but we still had many videos to edit. And then on that outing, the Air Force didn't allow us to enter the base. We had gotten our credentials. I sent in my credentials in June of last year. I sent it on June 25th. June 25th. I sent it directly to CLA. I didn't get a response. But then the launch, which should have been in June, was postponed to September, then to October, then to November. In the meantime, I sent my accreditation request to the DCTA. I sent it to Alcântara. Alcântara didn't solve it, so I'm sending it to the DCTA. DCTA didn't respond. I sent the accreditation to the Ministry of Defense. I moved up the hierarchy. I only got a response after sending it to the Ministry of Defense. No, you will, but they never gave a formal response. Never. I sent it in an official letter format. From Brazilian space to the Minister of Defense. From Brazilian space to the Director of DCTA. From Brazilian space to the Director of CLA. They never replied, and look, it's a public agency. They have to reply, even if it's just to say they can't, but they never replied. And the one time they did reply, they never answered the official letter. It was just a phone call. When we arrived in Alcântara, they wouldn't let us into the launch center to do the report. I didn't want to go where Rambit Nano was. That wasn't my goal. I wanted to go in there, film the center from the inside like other teams have done before. Right? There's a more restricted area that you can only enter with authorization. But that area that's open to everyone, at CTITO, I wanted to do some reports there, film the We Arrived segment, things like that. This is the launch center. This is to show people that we were there. It was part of the coverage. And we didn't have that access. That's why we also went back to São Luís. We left the car there because there was still no news that it had been definitely postponed in November. And we kept editing stories, publishing stories, and so on. And we complained to some people. Thank God we have it. And our stories got an audience. And then on Thursday night, it was announced there will be no more November launches. And we did the show in our weekly slot saying, look, there won't be a launch. We didn't get access. The Air Force didn't respond to us. I showed all our credentials, the communications with the people. I didn't mention anyone's name. I could have mentioned whose name. I didn't. That wasn't the case. It's not personal. It has to be an institutional relationship. It wasn't the person. It was the institution that failed. So I put the messages there and everything. That caused such a stir that by Friday morning, a colonel from the Air Force called me. Rui, are you Rui from Brazil? Yes, that's me. Oh, you're Colonel so-and-so from the Air Force? So I said, yes, Colonel. He said, well, I received more than 300 calls from a lot of people complaining in Brasilia, coming here for who knows what, saying that Brazil in particular didn't have access and so on and so forth. Even though another outlet had access, another channel, a YouTube channel that had access, why did the other channel have access and we didn't? Even though I applied for accreditation almost 6 months earlier, my attempts at accreditation, right? If I said, no, you came here, tried to get accredited last minute and didn't succeed, no. So this colonel came and said, oh, we'll welcome you here to visit the center, and if you want, you'll see Rambit Nano next to them. I just ask one favor, call people or make a video explaining that you are being assisted by the Air Force because I don't want to get any more calls from anyone asking me about this. And then thank God we grabbed Luca and crossed over. I remember well that it was a Friday because the colonel said, look, we're in São Luís. How are we going to cross now? We don't even know what Amarela is like. He said, if you aren't here by 1 p.m., you can't visit. That was around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. We're shutting down and no one will be here to meet you. Not from the press, right? From the protocol office, from the Air Force press office. And then I can't be responsible if you'll have access or not on Saturday, right? So Duda and I grabbed everything, checked out of the hotel with our bags in hand with what was left, but we rushed to the dock, speedboat. The tide was low. The speedboat couldn't leave, so we went to the ferry boat. We managed to catch a ferry boat, the barge, right? We crossed over, got there, and picked up our car. And we got there and managed to go through with the visit, right? So our article, we weren't the first outlet to publish, but our publications were the first to be released about Rambit Nano at the Alcântara Launch Center. Our videos, our reels, stories on Instagram and everything else. So we had that, and then the launch was canceled. Right there, we said goodbye to our friends Luis, Ribeiro, and Rodrigo. They took the ferry and went back by motorcycle, right? Ribeiro has a motorcycle. They went back by motorcycle, took the ferry, and returned to San Luis, while we took my car and drove back from Alcântara, taking the Alcântara road, going around the peninsula
para
to go back to Salvador. And if the road from San Luis was already bad, the Alcântara road was in terrible condition. My car is an SUV. It's a car with fantastic suspension. It's a vehicle I can't complain about, and let me tell you, the little guy went through a lot. Even though we were careful on the road, there were a lot of potholes and a lot of irregularities on the pavement. I keep imagining what the last stretch of transporting Rambitineno with that strap was like, right? I'm not sure if they went by ferry through San Luis or used this road. I think they went by ferry. I'm not sure. I need to ask and look into that question again. But it's really bad, really bad. So the return took longer precisely because of that stretch. We got stuck again at that highway junction near the metropolitan area of San Luis. We didn't even go into San Luis this time. We went straight to Teresina, right? But it took a long time, right? So basically, on Saturday we left relatively early, but we only managed to get to Teresina at night. So it was worse than when we left to go there. Our goal was to sleep in Picos again. So from Picos, we would return to Salvador and have a shorter stretch on the road on the last day, right? So we could arrive a bit more rested. But it was the opposite. We only managed to get to Teresina. I always wanted to do a long stretch on the first day and a shorter stretch on the second. But it didn't work out. It was the opposite. So in the end, we made it. We arrived in Salvador at 8, almost 9 o'clock at night on Sunday, right?
nesse
On our way back there.
Yes, that's right. And Rui, such a terrible road like this leading to a space center, you said it, right? It could have caused problems for the Rambit Nano itself, the passage through these roads. We all know that the Rambit Nano had a catastrophic failure during the ascent. But in the scenario of a space center on this road and with this infrastructure you're talking about, it's not just the spacecraft that goes through. Everyone who works there goes through, everyone who provides services there goes through, and everyone who is an enthusiast and wants to visit the space center goes through as well.
So
I keep thinking about how this poor access infrastructure to Alcântara actually contributes to making the center itself useless, right? Not only because of the lack of investment, but also because people themselves don't feel very comfortable either working at or visiting the center, the launch center, right?
it's a different kind of system, you know, Julio. I didn't imagine that. Salvador has something very similar to San Luis, right? Whether it's in terms of architecture or history, right? San Luis is a city that's a bit flatter than Salvador. It's a city that's very, well, not just a little, but much flatter. Salvador has a varied terrain, right? With ups and downs and all that. It's quite steep. But, you know, it really reminds me a lot. And the geography has a certain parallel. Why? Salvador is a peninsula and we cross by ferry by boat to Itaparica Island, right? The return by road is very long, just like it is with Alcântara. But there it's the opposite. The island is San Luis and Alcântara is a peninsula. So the situations are reversed there. But, you know, this comparison, I tell you, it's much harder to get to Alcântara. But, like, it's much harder than getting to Itaparica Island by waiting in line for the ferry boat here by car, or even as a pedestrian, right? Just like there's a ferry boat here in Salvador, we have boats, right? We have boats that cross over. They're like, I won't say they're adapted Severos, but they're boats used to transport people, made of wood, with those inboard engines, right? Diesel and all that. They also cross from Salvador to Mar Grande, which is a point closer to Salvador, right? On Itaparica Island. And Alcântara too, from São Luís to Alcântara, there's also a boat, right? You cross over by speedboat. That has it too, so there are two parallels. But here in Salvador, you don't interrupt the speedboat traffic, except during very, very, very low tides. I'm used to it because my family had a summer house on the island here. So I'm used to this crossing. But over there, it's something that honestly, I never imagined it would be like that. So I think it's pretty complicated, right? In the analysis we did in one of the shows we broadcast from there, we do an analysis about all these issues. And so when we talk about the advantages of Alcântara, we put those advantages into perspective. The issue of being close to the equator, which doesn't help with every orbit. This location is wonderful. There is competition from other places in the world for other orbits with different inclinations. They wouldn't necessarily need to come to Brazil, right? To launch, to bring payloads here. Yes, you start to see that more investment is needed, and there needs to be something on a larger scale. It can't be just the Maranhão government. It can't be just the Air Force. It has to be something on a more strategic level. But also, considering that I'm going to make this investment, what will be the return? That analysis also has to take that into account. Because if it's just this whole blah, 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 LATA will deliver the results mindset. We heard some absurd things here during the creation of LATA, like LATA would be the new SpaceX, a Brazilian SpaceX. We have to listen to these things. And it's not. LATA is nothing more than a government middleman. That's what it really is. It's a service intermediary. And there's this whole issue. So all of this needs to be thought about and considered. And it can't be hidden. Just saying it's the best location without explaining in what scenario this is the best location in the world. And in terms of logistics, it's not the best place in the world, right? So all of this has to be considered in this discussion. And we see a lot of shallow, very superficial talk, you know? And this kind of talk is encouraged by government entities. The Brazilian Army and the Air Force encourage this shallow talk. They don't want an in-depth discussion. They want this kind of more like superficial talk. And it may seem interesting now, but in the long run, in terms of sustainability, which is the problem with Brazil's program, the Brazilian space program lives off short-term bursts, right? So this LATA project from LATA could be another short-term burst, where you say, no, everything will be solved here, because we have the best place in the world. But at what cost? With what restrictions? You know, that's not entirely clear. So what's sought is media support and a very shallow level of discussion. And there's no attempt to create a discourse that brings a solution, something structural, sustainable, and long-term. And that's what we discuss a lot at Brazil in Space, and sometimes we're misunderstood. But nowadays, just by smiling to one side or the other, you already become someone's enemy or someone else's enemy. If you don't smile either, you become an enemy too. If you smile too much, you get canceled. So those are the times we're living in.
So
I would like,
after this in-depth discussion we've had here about the nature of the infrastructure, Brazilian aerospace activities, and also the limitations we've been facing. Today, I'm leaving the door open here, man. So we can have more interactions in the future, do more interviews, talk a bit more about this subject, which is now so important. It's so relevant for us, and we've been following the unfortunate developments, and we hope that one day they'll be overcome, okay? So, my dear friend Rui Botelho, thank you very much once again for your time, for all the vast knowledge you share with us here, always about the Brazilian experience in space. And I'd like to invite you back another time to come back here so we can talk much more about this subject, Rui.
Julio, I should be thanking you. It's truly a pleasure. This friendship that came from this search for knowledge, from this desire to know, to understand what the Brazilian space program is and what it isn't, and what it should always be along those lines. And that you, as I mentioned at the beginning, are one of the sources I use as a reference. The picture your master's dissertation paints of the Brazilian space program helps a lot, especially in the struggle Brazilian space is engaged in. We put it, actually, Dr. Valdemar puts it in our book here, which was released last year. He puts it right here, exactly in our preface, right? Guided by Dr. Valdemar. He says here that in Brazil, even the past is uncertain, that Brazilian space plays that role. When people decide to rewrite history later on, everything about what really happened is recorded on Brazilian space. So, it's based on that I thank you for the invitation, the opportunity, right? And for the partnership as always. Thank you very much.
For anyone who wants to buy this book, Rui, how do they do it?
Both books are available on Amazon. This is the newest one here.
So we're going to put the books here.
They were released by Apris Publishing. You can find it on Apris's portal. But it's good to check other outlets, other libraries, other stores, because sometimes you can find promotions, right? Sometimes it even includes free shipping. When we released this book, we managed to get free shipping with Amazon during the pre-launch. Okay? So whoever bought it during the pre-launch got that bonus of not having to pay for shipping, right? So it was a good partnership, so I recommend taking a look. But they're on the main media platforms, and there's also a digital version for those who don't. I still have, Julio, this issue. It's not that I can't, but I still have a preference for printed books. So, but for those who are already used to digital books, there's also that version.
E-book. All right then. My dear Rui Botelho, everyone who's watching us here, thank you so much for your partnership. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back soon with more news about space.